The week after J. Edgar Hoover died, a woman named Helen Gandy reported to work as usual. She had been his personal secretary for 54 years. She knew where everything was filed, what every code word meant, which folders contained which names. For the next 2 months, she fed those folders into a shredder and a fire. Box by box, the private record of nearly half a century of American power disappeared into ash and confetti. President Richard Nixon wanted it stopped. The acting director of the FBI wanted it stopped. Congress made noise about wanting it stopped. Nobody stopped it. That single fact, a dead man's secretary defying a sitting president and winning, tells you more about J. Edgar Hoover than any biography could, because the power he had built did not depend on his being alive. It had been threaded so deeply into the fabric of American government, into the private fears of senators and generals and presidents, that even his corpse could still give orders. He was never elected to anything. He never served in the military, never took a bullet, never ran a state or commanded troops. He did not marry. He did not travel abroad. He was not rich. For almost his entire adult life, he lived within a few miles of the Capitol building in the same Washington neighborhood where he had grown up. He died at 77 years old, alone on the floor of his bedroom, in his pajamas. And for 48 years, he ran the closest thing to a secret police that the United States of America has ever produced. That paradox is the whole story. John Edgar Hoover was born on New Year's Day, 1895, in Washington, D.C., into a household that ran on discipline and anxiety in roughly equal measure. His mother, Annie, was the organizer of the family, strict, proper, church-going, the kind of woman who believed that order was a form of morality. His father, Dickerson, was a government clerk who suffered from what the family called nervous breakdowns, and what we would probably now recognize as severe depression. He eventually had to be institutionalized. Young Edgar watched that happen and drew his own conclusions. He was a small, wiry boy with a stutter. Not a mild one, a real one, the kind that makes childhood a daily test of endurance. He solved it the way obsessive children often solve their problems, through sheer repetition and force of will. He trained himself to speak fast, to push through the blocks before they could form, to never let silence sit long enough to become embarrassing. His classmates at Central High School called him Speed. They meant it as a joke. He took it as a compliment. At school debates, the teenage Hoover argued against women's suffrage and against the abolition of capital punishment. These were not assigned positions. He chose them. A 17-year-old boy who looked at the world and saw a place that needed to be held firmly in place, where the wrong kind of change had to be resisted. That instinct never really left him. Until he was 43 years old, he lived with his mother. When she died in 1938, he reportedly did not know how to operate the household appliances she had managed for him his entire adult life. Hoover's first real job was at the Library of Congress, where he worked as a cataloger while studying law at night. He was 19 years old, filing books, memorizing classification systems, building indexes. Most young men in that position thought of it as temporary. Hoover thought of it as an education. What he learned in those stacks was not literary. It was structural. Information scattered randomly across thousands of shelves is just noise. The same information organized into a system, cross-referenced, indexed, retrievable on demand, and becomes something else entirely. It becomes power. The person who controls the catalog controls access. And access, Hoover understood at 19, is control. He would spend the next 50 years applying that lesson to human beings. In 1919, a bomb exploded on the doorstep of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's home in Washington. It was part of a coordinated series of anarchist mail bombings across the country. America was already frightened of Bolshevism, of labor unrest, of a world that had just survived one apocalyptic war and did not feel safe. The bombings ignited something close to national hysteria. Palmer needed someone to organize the response. He found a 24-year-old Justice Department lawyer who had already been compiling files on foreign-born radicals in his spare time, apparently just because he thought someone should. That lawyer was Hoover. Within months, Hoover had built a card index of 450,000 names, not 450,000 criminals. not 450,000 people who had been charged with anything. 450,000 people who had, in someone's judgment, expressed opinions that sounded radical. Immigrants, labor organizers, socialists, anarchists, people who had attended a meeting once, people who had subscribed to a newsletter. In January of 1920, federal agents coordinated raids across 33 cities in a single night. Somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people were arrested. Records differ, in part because proper records were not kept, which was itself the point. People were held without charges. Deportation proceedings began on flimsy legal grounds. The raids were conducted almost entirely without warrants. Courts later found much of it unconstitutional. Palmer's presidential ambitions collapsed under the backlash. His political career was finished. Hoover's was just beginning. He had learned 3 things from the Palmer raids that he would carry for the rest of his life. First, the public could be frightened into accepting almost any measure if the threat was framed dramatically enough. Second, a cooperative press would amplify that fear rather than scrutinize it. Third, when things went wrong, there was always someone else to blame. Palmer took the fall. Hoover walked away clean, his files intact, his reputation not merely undamaged, but actually enhanced. He had shown he could build a system. The system had worked. That the system had destroyed innocent people was a separate matter, not his department. In 1924, at 29 years old, Hoover was handed the Bureau of Investigation, a wreck of an agency rotten with political corruption and incompetence, infamous for its abuses during the Palmer era. The Attorney General who appointed him, Harlan Fiske Stone, thought he was getting a capable young administrator who would clean house and follow rules. Hoover did clean house. He created a rigorous selection process. Agents had to be lawyers or accountants, physically fit, presentable, male, and white. He established the first forensic laboratory in American law enforcement. He centralized the country's fingerprint records for the first time. He made the FBI, as it would come to be called, into something that functioned like a real institution. And while he was doing all of that, he was building something else. In a separate part of the file room, in folders labeled personal and confidential, Hoover began keeping records that had nothing to do with crime. Records about the private lives of politicians, the financial arrangements of judges, the affairs of powerful men, the secrets that people in Washington, D.C. accumulate the way cities accumulate debt, quietly, inevitably, and with consequences that outlast anyone's intentions. Nobody authorized this. Nobody knew about it, not fully. It was simply a thing he had decided to do, the way a librarian might decide to start a private collection alongside the public one. By the time anyone understood what he had built, it was far too late to take it apart. There is a particular kind of threat that never has to be spoken out loud. When a senator walks into a budget hearing knowing that the man across town has a folder with his name on it, a folder that might contain anything that he has never seen and cannot subpoena, that exists in a building he does not control, he does not need to receive a phone call, he does not need an envelope slid across a table. The folder's existence is the message, the uncertainty is the mechanism. He will remember that folder when the vote comes. He will remember it when a journalist calls asking questions. He will remember it every single time J. Edgar Hoover needs something from him. For nearly 5 decades, this is how American democracy actually functioned. The filing system Hoover built had 2 distinct tracks, and understanding the difference between them is essential. The official records of the FBI were substantial enough. Case files, criminal records, fingerprint databases, the administrative architecture of a major federal agency. These were the files that congressional oversight committees occasionally reviewed, the ones that existed on paper in a way that bureaucratic Washington could comprehend. Then there were the personal and confidential files. Hoover kept these separately in his own office suite under his own control. They were not indexed in the Bureau's main system. They were not accessible to other agents. When he died, they did not automatically transfer to his successor. They transferred to Helen Gandy, who spent 2 months feeding them into destruction while the president watched helplessly from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. What was in them? Enough has survived or been reconstructed from other sources to give a partial picture. Eleanor Roosevelt's file ran to thousands of pages. Hoover had begun compiling it in the 1930s, tracking her friendships, her correspondence, her associations with progressive organizations, her relationships. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of a sitting president and then one of the most admired women in the world. Hoover surveilled her for decades anyway, not because she was a criminal, but because she was powerful, and more importantly, because she associated with people he considered dangerous, civil rights advocates, labor organizers, anyone who wanted the country to change faster than he was comfortable with. Albert Einstein arrived in the United States in 1933, fleeing Nazi Germany. He was the most famous scientist on Earth. Hoover opened a file on him almost immediately. By the time Einstein died in 1955, that file was 1,427 pages long. Its primary concern was not espionage. It was Einstein's political opinions, his support for civil rights, his skepticism about the arms race, his correspondence with international peace organizations. 1,427 pages on a physicist who wanted to stop nuclear war. Ernest Hemingway believed in his final years that federal agents were following him. His friends thought it was paranoia, a symptom of the depression and physical decline that eventually consumed him. He checked into a psychiatric facility. He received electroconvulsive therapy. He lost the ability to write. He died by suicide in 1961. Decades later, his FBI file confirmed that the surveillance was real. He had not been paranoid. He had been watched. John F. Kennedy's file documented his extramarital affairs in considerable detail, including his relationship with a woman who was simultaneously involved with a figure connected to organized crime. Hoover knew. Kennedy knew that Hoover knew. When Kennedy became president and his brother Robert became Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, who despised Hoover and wanted him gone, J. Edgar Hoover was not fired. He was not retired. He was kept exactly where he was. Lyndon Johnson hated Hoover with a specific visceral intensity that his aides documented in private memos. He called him names in private that would not survive editorial standards here. And when Johnson became president, he signed an executive order exempting Hoover from the mandatory federal retirement age, allowing him to stay in his position indefinitely. When reporters asked why, Johnson gave an answer that became one of the more coldly honest statements in American political history. It is better, he explained, to have him inside the tent doing certain things outward than outside doing them inward. Johnson had a file, too. The machine worked through atmosphere more than action. Hoover did occasionally use his files in direct, documentable ways, leaking damaging information to compliant journalists, feeding material to congressional investigators, arranging for stories to appear at convenient moments. But the more pervasive mechanism was simpler and more insidious than that. Washington is a city of people who have done things they regret, made compromises they cannot fully defend, accumulated the ordinary secrets of ambitious lives. Hoover simply made sure they knew he knew. The actual content of any given folder mattered less than the awareness that the folder existed. Fear of the hypothetical is often more powerful than fear of the concrete because it cannot be reasoned with. There is no defense against a threat you cannot see. Senators who might have pushed back on FBI budget requests found reasons not to. Journalists who might have investigated the Bureau found other stories more interesting. Judges who might have ruled differently in cases involving federal surveillance found the legal reasoning on reflection to support the government's position. None of this required explicit communication. The system enforced itself. But there was one man Hoover could not quietly neutralize, one man whose influence was not rooted in Washington power or institutional leverage, whose authority came from moral force rather than political position, and whom Hoover could not buy, frighten, or absorb. Martin Luther King Jr. had been on Hoover's radar since the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. As the civil rights movement grew, as King became its most visible and eloquent voice, As his image began appearing on the front pages of newspapers around the world, Hoover's fixation deepened into something that went beyond professional antagonism. In December of 1964, days after King received the Nobel Peace Prize, Hoover called a press conference and described him as the most notorious liar in the country. It was an extraordinary thing for the director of the FBI to say publicly about a private citizen. It suggested something that had slipped past calculation into something more personal. The Bureau had been wiretapping King since the early 1960s, with authorization from Attorney General Robert Kennedy, a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside Kennedy's reputation as a civil rights ally, and which tells you something about how broadly the surveillance machinery had been normalized within government. FBI agents installed listening devices in hotel rooms where King stayed across the country. They recorded his private conversations, his telephone calls, his meetings with aides and advisors. In November of 1964, someone at the FBI, the order has never been definitively traced to a specific individual, though the Church Committee investigation in the 1970s concluded the Bureau was responsible, mailed King a package. Inside was a reel of audio tape and a letter. The letter was written to appear as though it came from a disillusioned black activist, someone on King's own side who had been recording his behavior and was now sickened by what he had found. The recordings on the tape were of King's private conversations in hotel rooms. The letter told him in language that left no ambiguity that he should consider taking his own life before the material became public. It suggested he had 34 days. The package was opened by Coretta Scott King. King did not break. He showed the letter to advisors, contacted attorneys, and continued working. He gave the speech at Selma. He marched across the bridge. He kept going. But the fact of that letter, mailed by a federal law enforcement agency to a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, urging him towards suicide in the year of our Lord 1964, is not a footnote in American history. It is one of the central facts about what kind of country this was. COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, ran officially from 1956 to 1971, though its tactics predated its formal existence and its effects outlasted its termination. It was at its core a program of domestic political warfare conducted by the federal government against its own citizens. The targets were not spies, they were not enemy agents. The targets were the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the American Indian Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, the antiwar movement, and eventually any organization that the Bureau decided was moving the country in a direction Hoover did not approve of. At various points, the program also monitored the Ku Klux Klan, though its operations against the Klan were notably less aggressive than those against civil rights organizations, a disparity the Church Committee documented in considerable detail. The tactics were ingenious in their cruelty. Anonymous letters were mailed to the spouses of movement leaders, containing fabricated or real evidence of infidelity, designed to destroy marriages and discredit individuals. Forged correspondence was sent between rival factions, engineering splits, and suspicions in organizations that were already operating under enormous pressure. Informants were placed inside groups with instructions not merely to gather intelligence, but to actively provoke, to push organizations toward more extreme positions, to manufacture incidents that could then be used to justify further surveillance or criminal prosecution. The full cost of COINTELPRO is impossible to calculate because most of it happened in private. A marriage that broke up, a leader who lost credibility, an organization that fell apart from internal conflict that had been deliberately manufactured from outside. The program's greatest damage was to things that are hard to count: trust, solidarity, and the capacity of people working for social change to believe in each other. One case does allow for precise accounting. In Chicago, in December of 1969, an FBI informant inside the Illinois Black Panther Party provided the Bureau with detailed information about the apartment where the party's 21-year-old chairman, Fred Hampton, lived and slept, the floor plan, the layout of the rooms, the location of his bed. The Bureau shared this information with the Chicago Police Department. Before dawn on December 4th, police officers entered the apartment. Hampton was killed in his bed. He was 21 years old. A subsequent federal investigation found that between 82 and 99 shots had been fired into the apartment by police. One shot had been fired outward. The end of COINTELPRO came not from inside the government, but from a break-in. On the night of March 8, 1971, the same night Muhammad Ali fought Joe Frazier in Madison Square Garden, when every television and radio in the country was pointed elsewhere, a small group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into the Bureau's field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They took every document in the office and mailed copies to journalists and members of Congress. The documents revealed for the first time the word COINTELPRO. They revealed surveillance programs, informant networks, and operations targeting student groups, anti-war organizations, and black political movements. The Washington Post reported the story. Other outlets followed. Hoover, for the first time in his career, was genuinely on the defensive. He terminated COINTELPRO formally the following month. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge wrongdoing. He issued a directive tightening security procedures for field offices so that the next group of activists who tried to do what the media burglars had done would find less paper to take. The machine kept running. It just ran more quietly. There is a particular kind of man who mistakes the world for having stopped moving the day he formed his final opinion of it. Hoover formed his in approximately 1924. By the late 1960s, the country he had appointed himself to protect was unrecognizable to him. Young men were burning draft cards on courthouse steps. Women were marching for rights he had testified against as a teenager. Black Americans were demanding loudly and in the streets the full citizenship that the Constitution had promised them a century earlier, and the country had spent a century refusing to deliver. Rock music played from every radio. Hair grew long. The old certainties about communism, about morality, about who deserved to be surveilled and who deserved to be trusted, were being interrogated publicly by millions of people who had simply decided they were no longer willing to accept them. Hoover looked at all of this and saw a communist conspiracy, not metaphorically, not as a rhetorical shorthand. He genuinely believed, to the end of his life, that the social upheaval of the 1960s was being orchestrated by Moscow, that the civil rights movement was a vector of foreign subversion, that the anti-war protesters were agents of influence, whether they knew it or not. His agents filed reports that confirmed this view. His analysts shaped their conclusions to match his expectations. Inside the Bureau, by the late 60s, disagreeing with the director had become professionally fatal, which meant the director received intelligence that told him what he already believed, which confirmed his beliefs, which shaped the intelligence in a circle that had been turning for decades and had long since lost contact with observable reality. He was 70 years old, and he had not meaningfully updated his understanding of the country since Harry Truman was president. The cracks began showing in ways that could not be concealed. William Sullivan had been one of Hoover's most trusted lieutenants, the head of the Domestic Intelligence Division, the man who had run COINTELPRO's most aggressive operations, who had written some of the most damaging material the Bureau had produced against King and others. Sullivan was not, by any reasonable measure, a moderate or a reformer. He was a loyal Hoover man who had done things for the director that he would spend the rest of his life attempting to explain to congressional investigators. But by 1971, Sullivan had concluded that Hoover was, as he put it in a memo that he knew might end his career, no longer able to function effectively. The director was repeating himself in meetings. He was issuing contradictory instructions. He was making decisions based on grievances and obsessions that had calcified decades earlier. He was, Sullivan wrote, a man living in the past. Hoover's response was to strip Sullivan of his duties, change the locks on his office while he was traveling, and leave his belongings in a box in the hallway. It was the response of a man who had been running things for so long that the idea of being questioned had become to him a form of insubordination. He had outlasted 8 presidents. He had watched careers begin and end. He had files on everyone. The notion that someone inside his own building might look at him and see a diminished old man was not a thing he could process as information. It was a thing he processed as betrayal. Richard Nixon had known Hoover for more than 20 years by the time he became president in 1969. They had a genuine friendship of sorts, rooted in shared anti-communism and a shared instinct for seeing enemies everywhere. Nixon had been one of the young congressmen Hoover had cultivated in the late 1940s, feeding him information about Alger Hiss and the communist infiltration hearings that had made Nixon's early reputation. They had history. But Nixon was also a practical man, and by 1970 he had begun to see Hoover as a liability. The specific breaking point was the Houston Plan, a proposal developed by Nixon aide Tom Houston for a comprehensive, coordinated domestic intelligence operation involving the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and military intelligence. The plan called for expanded wiretapping, mail-opening, break-ins, and infiltration of dissident groups. It was, in essence, an attempt to formalize and coordinate exactly what Hoover had been doing for decades on his own initiative. Hoover killed it, not because he objected to the surveillance, not because he had developed late career scruples about constitutional rights. He killed it because the Houston Plan would have brought other agencies into territory he considered the FBI's exclusive domain. It would have created oversight structures that would have reduced his autonomy. It would have given other people access to operations that he controlled alone. The logic was the same logic he had applied his entire career. Power is only useful if it is concentrated, and it is only concentrated if it is not shared. Nixon, furious, rescinded the plan. He began looking for ways to remove Hoover that would not trigger the political explosion of an open confrontation with a man who had been in his position since Calvin Coolidge's administration. He found no way that satisfied him. Hoover was too embedded, too known, too dangerous to push. By 1972, the two men were barely speaking. On the evening of May 1st, 1972, Hoover had dinner as usual with his associate director, Clyde Tolson, his companion of 40 years. The man who had eaten almost every meal with him and accompanied him on almost every trip for the better part of 5 decades. Their relationship has been the subject of significant historical speculation. Hoover never addressed it publicly, never addressed much of anything personal publicly. But whatever its nature, Tolson was the closest thing to an intimate that Hoover had. The two men ate, they talked, and then Hoover went home alone to the house on 30th Place Northwest, where he had lived since his mother died. Sometime during the night, he got out of bed. His housekeeper found him the next morning on the floor of his bedroom. The cause of death was listed as hypertensive cardiovascular disease. He was 77 years old. He had been director of the FBI for 48 years, serving under every president from Calvin Coolidge to Richard Nixon. He died alone in his pajamas on the floor of a room in a house in the neighborhood where he was born. Helen Gandy arrived at the office and began destroying the personal and confidential files. She worked methodically the way Hoover himself had always worked, box by box, folder by folder, 51 boxes of material by her own later account to congressional investigators, destroyed in the weeks following his death. She maintained that the destroyed files were purely personal, correspondence and social notes, nothing of investigative or governmental significance. Congressional investigators were skeptical. They had no way to prove otherwise. The files were gone. Whatever Hoover had on the 37 men who had served in the Senate during his tenure, whatever he had on the Supreme Court justices whose confirmation hearings he had quietly observed, whatever he had accumulated over 48 years on the private lives of the most powerful people in the most powerful country in the world, it is ash. It has been ash since the spring of 1972, burned by a woman who had given her working life to a man who asked her, even in death, to keep his secrets. She did. What did he win? By the narrowest possible measure, quite a lot. He died in his own home of natural causes, his reputation not yet fully dismantled. The worst of what he had done, COINTELPRO, the letter to King, the systematic destruction of political movements, was not yet fully public. The church committee investigations that would document his abuses in congressional testimony did not begin until 1975, 3 years after his death. He never sat before a committee. He never answered for Fred Hampton. He never answered for Ernest Hemingway. He never answered for the thousands of people whose lives his bureau had quietly, methodically ruined over 5 decades. In that sense, he escaped. But look at the longer ledger. Every movement he tried to destroy won. The civil rights movement, which he surveilled, infiltrated, and worked to discredit for 2 decades, produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Segregation was dismantled. The legal architecture of American apartheid collapsed. Martin Luther King Jr. has a federal holiday. His memorial in Washington, D.C., a 30-foot granite figure rising from a mountain of stone, stands less than 2 miles from the building that bears J. Edgar Hoover's name. The building that bears Hoover's name is the headquarters of the FBI. The memorial to the man Hoover tried to destroy with anonymous letters and hotel room recordings overlooks the tidal basin. It has been there since 2011. It will be there considerably longer than the building's name will. The anti-war movement that Hoover cataloged as communist subversion helped end American involvement in Vietnam. The women's movement that he dismissed as another strand of left-wing agitation produced transformations in American law and culture that are now so thoroughly embedded they are invisible. The LGBTQ movement, whose members Hoover considered blackmail material, whose presence in government he used as leverage, has achieved legal recognition in America that would have been literally unimaginable to anyone sitting in Hoover's Washington. Everything he tried to hold still kept moving. His legacy did produce one category of genuine, lasting change, though not the kind he intended. Because of what Hoover built and what investigators found after his death, the United States enacted specific structural reforms designed to prevent any single person from ever accumulating that kind of institutional power again. The FBI director's term was capped at 10 years, a limit that exists specifically because Hoover had served 48. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a federal court to oversee domestic wiretapping requests because Hoover had conducted surveillance for decades with no judicial oversight whatsoever. The Attorney General's guidelines of 1976 imposed formal limits on domestic intelligence operations because COINTELPRO had operated for 15 years without any. These reforms are real. They matter. But they are also the reforms of people who believe the problem was procedural rather than structural. That if you capped the term, created the oversight court, wrote the guidelines, you had addressed what went wrong. History has been somewhat unkind to that optimism. The surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 showed a domestic intelligence apparatus that had expanded enormously beyond what FISA's architects had imagined. The debate about FBI conduct that erupted in the 2010s and 2020s showed an agency whose institutional culture still bore marks that could be traced back to its founder. You can change the rules. Changing what an institution believes about itself is a slower project. In 2027, the remaining classified files on the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. are scheduled for full public release. The partial releases that have occurred already have been disturbing enough, documenting not just the surveillance itself, but the institutional thinking behind it, the memos that rationalized it, the chain of command that approved it. The full release will require the country to look again at what its government did to its most celebrated advocate for human dignity in his own lifetime with the resources of federal law enforcement. It will not be comfortable reading. America has been having that reckoning in pieces for 50 years. It is not finished. Here's what I keep coming back to. Hoover was not a villain in the way that villains appear in the stories we tell about history. He did not wear a symbol of evil. He did not revel in what he did. He went to church. He loved his dog. He had the same breakfast every morning. He was, in the textural details of daily life, an almost aggressively ordinary man. Tidy, habitual, careful, punctual. the kind of bureaucrat that institutions produce and depend upon. He genuinely believed he was protecting the country. He genuinely believed that the people he surveilled and destroyed were dangers that had to be contained. That belief did not make him monstrous in the theatrical sense. It made him something considerably more dangerous than that. It made him certain, and what he proved over 48 years is a thing that democracies have to relearn in every generation because they can never quite accept it. That the machinery of surveillance, once built, develops its own institutional momentum. It does not require a monster to operate. It requires only a bureaucrat with a filing system and the sincere conviction that some people's rights are less important than other people's safety. Give that bureaucrat a lifetime appointment, no meaningful oversight, and access to the private fears of the people who might otherwise hold him accountable. And you have described not a historical curiosity, but a standing possibility. The files are gone, the machine is not.